What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and in this video we're going to talk about the differences between trekking pole tents and freestanding tents, the pros and cons of each, and at the end of this video I'm going to tell you why I've been using one over the other for the past year, and I'm also going to give you the best inexpensive version of each. It's lighter weight. Since it relies on trekking poles, the added weight of tent poles isn't an issue. And since you're going to be using trekking poles for your trekking pole tent, now you'll maybe start using the actual trekking poles because they're super helpful. They're helpful to keep you balanced on trail, and they take the weight off of your back onto your arms. Trekking pole tents are actually pretty easy to set up. Some people might say that the opposite is true, but that's probably because they have very little experience setting up a trekking pole tent. After a few times setting it up, out in your yard or even out on trail, it's going to get a lot easier over time. They're super easy to set up in the rain. This is an enormous benefit, especially if you are experiencing rain when you're about to set up your tent, because all you have to do with the trekking pole tent is take the trekking poles, raise up the roof of the tent, and the inside of your tent is likely going to stay really dry. They pack up really small. No poles and less material means that it's going to pack up a lot smaller inside of your backpack. And they're typically cheaper because you're just buying fabric and you're not buying the added expense of tent poles. Let's talk about freestanding tents and the pros of those. They're gonna have a lot more luxury to them, a lot more accessories and pockets and gear lofts and all kinds of other things to make it feel like a hotel in the backcountry. But just be mindful of all that added weight that's gonna be on that tent, and you're gonna have to carry all that out into the backcountry. They're better with condensation. Most freestanding tents are double wall tents, meaning there's an inner tent and an outer rainfly, and that inner tent is gonna keep you separated from that rainfly, which is where all that condensation is gonna develop. And that in turn is gonna keep you nice and dry. Trekking poles are not needed. And of course, that is one less thing to carry. But if you're already carrying trekking poles on your backpacking trip and you're carrying a freestanding tent, you really should maybe think about possibly picking up a trekking pole tent instead, because the tent poles for that freestanding tent are one less thing you're gonna have to carry. There's usually a lot more headroom. There's really no limit to how manufacturers will design a tent with their tent poles. They get really creative to give you a lot more living space to sit up, change your clothes, wait out a storm, just have a lot more headroom in general. Staking out a freestanding tent isn't totally necessary. This is actually super nice if you want to pick up your tent and move it if you don't like exactly where you've put it. Maybe it's on an angle or it's just in an area that you don't really like. But if you want to use your vestibules, you definitely want to use your stakes. As you're shopping for tents, you may have heard the term semi-freestanding. This is actually kind of confusing knowing the difference. So basically, if a tent is semi-freestanding, that just means that the tent is still going to have a pole structure, but not all of the poles will end up at a corner of the tent. So you'll usually need one or two stakes to set it up properly, but the tent will still hold the majority of its shape. There's more campsite options with a freestanding tent. Less staking out means you're gonna have a lot more options for setting up a tent. Even if you're setting up on rocky terrain, it's gonna be a lot easier to set up the tent because it doesn't need the amount of stakes that a trekking pole tent is gonna need. Freestanding tents can typically be a lot warmer. Because there's two walls in a freestanding tent, you'll have more insulation from the cold. I've noticed that there's about a 3 to 5 degree increase in temperature with each wall in wintry conditions. All right, let's talk about the cons of trekking pole tents and freestanding tents, because there definitely are some. Let's start off with the trekking pole tent. Well, the first con is they obviously require trekking poles. So you'll need to buy trekking poles and you'll either need to carry them or use them. Now, if you're going to buy a trekking pole tent and you're going to carry trekking pole tents, then I would highly encourage you at least use the trekking poles. Or at the very least, just try using one trekking pole. It really does make a huge difference on your hike. They're typically single wall, which makes condensation a big issue. Now, condensation is inevitable in either a double wall or a single wall tent. You'll need to be careful not to touch the walls of your tent or to let the gear touch the walls of your tent, because when you do, everything inside of your tent is probably going to get wet. Pitching can be a challenge because they got to be staked out. Staking out a trekking pole tent is an absolute must, unfortunately, and they take a lot more tent stakes than a freestanding tent. So if you're on, let's say, rocky ground and you need to stake out that tent, you're going to need to find rocks to hold up that tent because it absolutely needs to be staked out in order to be set up effectively. Trekking pole tents usually have very little luxuries. Now, if you're a minimalist, you're going to like this, and trekking pole tents are typically a minimalist tent. So you're not going to see gear lofts or pockets or lots of extra headroom in trekking pole tents for that reason. Trekking pole tents tend to have less headroom. Because they only use two straight up and down trekking poles, there's only so many designs that a trekking pole tent can have. And almost all of them require a massive loss in headroom compared to a freestanding tent. So waiting out storms and just hanging out in your tent in general can be kind of a pain, and honestly, it makes it a little bit difficult to clean it out too. The last con of trekking pole tents is that they can actually be really difficult to get in and out of. This is because the trekking pole sits right in front of the door on most designs. Now, some manufacturers have figured out a way to design the tent so that the trekking poles are just off center to avoid this, but most designs, it's difficult to get in and out of. All right, let's move on to the cons of a freestanding tent. First off, they can be really bulky. Since freestanding tents are typically double wall and you're gonna have to carry poles, this means you're gonna have to carry a lot more fabric and the poles to try to pack it all up. Freestanding tents are a lot heavier. Just the tent poles for a freestanding tent could be 1/3 to half the weight of the entire tent. And every wall that you've got in a tent, that's all that extra fabric that's gonna bring weight to that tent. But of course, when you look at a trekking pole tent, you're still gonna need to carry the weight of those trekking poles, so hopefully you're using them. Another con of a freestanding tent is that, really, you should be staking it out regardless. I honestly can't think of any time that I didn't stake out a freestanding tent. The only time I've left it unstaked is when I was just trying to move it around to see where I liked it. But you really should stake it out if you're gonna experience any type of weather or you just wanna use your vestibules. Another con of a freestanding tent is that there's typically more parts of it that are gonna fail. The more parts of a tent you've got, both walls, all the extra luxuries, the tent poles, that's just more stuff that can fail on you while you're out in the backcountry. And the last con of freestanding tents is that they're typically a lot more expensive because you got the added cost of the poles, all the extra materials, all of the other luxuries that they're trying to sell you. It gets a lot more expensive. And replacement parts for all that stuff can be really expensive. So if you followed my channel at all for the past year, you've noticed that I've used a trekking pole tent on virtually every single hike. Now, part of that's because I've been testing out trekking pole tents because that's just sort of how it's worked out. But honestly, I think I like using a trekking pole tent a little bit better for a couple of the reasons we mentioned. One, it's a lot easier to pack up, a lot lighter weight, easier to set up in the weather, and I already bring trekking poles so I don't have to carry extra tent poles, which is really nice. Now, that doesn't mean I don't love a good freestanding tent. I definitely do. So I do carry a few really lightweight options for tents, for shorter trips especially, or if I just want to use it like, say, in a really cold environment and I want that extra insulation. So my guess is you're still shopping for a tent and you're still deciding which one you're going to buy. So I've got two options for you. Both are very inexpensive option. One is a freestanding tent and one is a trekking pole tent. The freestanding tent that I would recommend is the Pria Outdoors Bryce one-person tent. Fantastic tent, fully freestanding, and it's very inexpensive. And then a really inexpensive and what I think is probably the best trekking pole tent on the market right now is the Durston X-Mid tent. This tent is a little bit heavier at over 30 ounces, plus you still have to add trekking poles, but it's very easy to set up and the price alone makes it worth it. Hey, real quick, I want you to come camping with me. Yes, I actually do want you to come camping with me. In August of 2024, I'm gonna be going to Banff National Park in Canada, and there are 20 spots available. They are filling up extremely fast. Last year we did this in Yellowstone. That filled up super quick. So if you want more information, click the link in the description below right here and check out how we can go camping together. It's gonna be awesome.